Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Translation Studies and Training, SOTST. Master of Arts, Translation Studies, Maths, English. First year. MTT 011 Translation, History and Tradition. Block-2 Translation of Buddhist texts into Chinese and native Indian languages. Unit-5 Translation of Buddhist texts into Chinese language. 5.0 Objectives. This unit deals with the tradition of translation of Buddhist scriptures into Chinese. Reading this unit will give the learners of MA in Translation Studies an overview of the tradition of translation of Buddhist literature into Chinese and other foreign languages. This unit will provide an overview of the problems faced by Indian and Chinese translators while translating Buddhist texts from Pali and Sanskrit to Chinese. In this sequence, we will also get information about the dedicated intellectuals who dedicated their whole life to the propagation of Buddhism in China through translation. We will also investigate the myth that the relationship between India and China was based only on Buddhism. The fact is that Buddhism entered China only in the course of Indo-Chinese movement for trade and business. Wherever necessary, we will also discuss the initial period of India-China business relations. In this sequence, we get acquainted about Buddha and Buddhism and see how the closeness of both the countries increased due to Buddhism. In fact, this discussion will remain incomplete in the absence of correct knowledge of Buddhism and Buddhist scriptures. Apart from this, the challenges faced by Indian and Chinese translators shall also be discussed. 5.1 Introduction. Many traditions, beliefs and practices are found in Buddhism, which are based on the teachings of Mahatma Buddha only. In Pali and Sanskrit, Buddha means the awakened one. According to the Tripitaka, Pali meaning 3 baskets, Buddha was born in Lumbini around 563 BCE. He was brought up in Kapilvastu. Today both these places are in Nepal. The time of propagation of Buddha's word in northeast India was believed to be from 4th to 6th century BCE. His followers believed that Buddha was a perfect man who showed the path of freedom from suffering to mere living beings and gave the path for attaining nirvana by skipping the cycle of life and death. It is rarely remembered today that the history of ideological relations between India and China is more than 2000 years old. This relation had a deep impact on the history and culture of both the countries. It is discussed to some extent by scholars working on the history of Buddhism. Buddhism began to spread from India to China from the 1st century and it remained powerful in China until the dominance of Confucianism and Taoism. Confucianism and Taoism still hold sway in China. In fact, it would be more appropriate to view Confucianism as a philosophy rather than a religion. Confucius was an eminent thinker who taught the tricks of governance to the rulers of China, so that the people there could be kept under the control of the king. The thoughts of Confucius have the same place in China as that of Chanakya in India. It has already been said that religion was the only factor in Indo-China mutual relations in the first millennium. In order to better understand the history of 1/3 of the world's population, it is necessary to investigate India-China relations in depth. The mutual relations between these two countries are also important from the contemporary political and social point of view. Religion has undoubtedly been the main basis of India-China contact. Buddhism has an important contribution behind the ideological exchange between the two countries. But it is worth noting that Buddhism has a profound influence on science, mathematics, literature, linguistics, architecture, medical science and music. There is another interesting aspect to this process of translation influenced by Buddhism. Indian translators who translated Buddhist texts into Chinese. Almost every one of them accepted Buddhism and settled in China, but the Chinese translators who translated Buddhist texts from Sanskrit or Pali into Chinese had come to India as a traveler. They studied Sanskrit and Pali in Indian universities, mastered the Chinese translation of Buddhist texts, gathered a lot of information about India and returned to China. There is no evidence whatsoever that Indian translators went to China for translation work to propagate Buddhism and then came back. That's why we have very little information about China during this period, but there is a lot of information related to this period about India in China. It cannot be denied that India and China came closer to each other through the translation of Buddhist texts and learned a lot about each other during the early period of mutual relations. 5.2 Religion and Business. Since trade and commerce have played a major role in the propagation of Buddhism, it is necessary to briefly discuss trade and commerce while discussing the translation of Buddhist texts. This discussion dates back to the 7th century BC, found in Chinese literary works. Tamralipti was an important port in Bengal which traded with China, Lanka, Java and Sumatra in 77. There is also evidence that in the times relating to BCE, India and China traded through the South China Gulf. Chinese documents and the writings of the Greek geographer Ptolemy mention that Indian colonies were found in modern Southeast Asia at the beginning of this period. Sugar was called Sini because it was imported from China. It is mentioned in the Mahabharata that Yudhishthira received silk as a gift from China. Period of Mahabharata is considered to be 3rd millennium BCE. Undoubtedly there were trade relations between India and China during this period. Chinese texts also mention that Chinese people traveled to Malacca and beyond. This gives evidence that trade relations existed between China and South India. Silk and sugar were imported from China to India. In China, sugar was called Sini and silk was called Chinan Shuk. Sana or Chinan means cloth to be folded. In exchange, perfume, coral and chilies were exported to China from India. Recently it has also been learned that the people of South India used to work as middlemen in the trade between China and West Asia. Trade between China and West Asia was done through Tamil ports. For a long time, since BCE 500, the trade of Malabar and Coromandel coast areas with China continued to flourish. Cashew from China continued to be sent by South Indian ships to West Asia and East Africa. Even in the 1st century, there is evidence of South India's trade going beyond Java, Sumatra to China and Japan. Maritime trade between China and South India continued till the 6th century. Religious groups moving from North India to China in the early period also helped to increase trade relations between China and South India. 5.3 Challenges faced by translators. In the early days of civilization, the task of translating Buddhist scriptures was fraught with difficulties. Why would the Chinese rulers like Buddhism after all? China had its own good religion. So, was Buddhism superior to the religion prevalent in China? Answering these questions is not easy. Significantly, in the initial period, Buddhism was accepted in China not as a religion, but as a philosophy. The Chinese rulers sent ambassadors to invite Buddhist monks from India to gain knowledge of Buddhism. At that time, Buddhism was known as an excellent educational philosophy. By the way, it is difficult for a non-Chinese person to pronounce Chinese names correctly or to write them correctly in Hindi English, so it is possible that these Chinese names may not have been written correctly. But in the case of Buddhist names, no such problem arises. The first Buddhist monks who came to China were known as Motan and Chufalan. They were received by Hong Lucy, the equivalent of today's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It is discussed in history that various rulers of China sent translators to India where they acquired knowledge of Sanskrit and Pali languages. After this, they stayed in India for a long time and translated Buddhist scriptures into Chinese language and then went back to China. After the entry of Buddhism in China in CE 65 to 67, the biggest challenge was to translate Buddhist scriptures into Chinese. from the 2nd to the 4th century BCE. This challenging task was undertaken by translators from India, Central Asia, Parthia, Indo-Scythia, who are believed to be an offshoot of the Sakas and who are believed to have migrated through southern Siberia to Bactria, Soyana, Arachosia, Gandhara, Kashmir, Punjab, Gujarat, Maharashtra and Rajasthan. This arduous task continued for centuries after Buddhism was established in China. The ideas of Buddhism were completely different from the traditional Chinese ideas. Apart from this, Sanskrit was also completely different from the Chinese. Sanskrit had a well-developed grammar while Chinese grammar was still not systematic. Very early on, translators had to phonetically convert Indian names into Chinese in order to translate the esoteric ideological expressions of Buddhism into the Chinese script. It should also be remembered that the Chinese script is hieroglyphic, and the nature of its meaning is suggestive. In contrast, the Sanskrit, Devanagari script is alphabet-based, phonetic and guided by many innate grammatical rules and exceptions. Arthur F. Wright says that China has not had a tradition of breaking down personalities into their constituents, whereas in India the science of psychological interpretation was sufficiently developed. There is also a big difference between the two in the concepts of space and time. In China, space was seen as finite and time was seen as the lives of individuals or political periods. In India, on the other hand, space and time were considered eternal and were measured on the cosmic scale and not on the scale of ordinary life. There is also a big difference in the social and political beliefs of these two ancient civilizations. According to Confucius, society is a kind of divine provision based on 5 types of relationships. These are the 5 relationships. 1. Relationship between the king and the subjects. 2. Relationship between father and son. 3. Relationship between husband and wife. 4. Relationship between elder and younger brothers and 5. Relationship between friends. According to the principle of mercy propounded by Confucius, religion means worship of heaven. Apart from the worship of heaven for the public, nothing else is necessary from the point of view of religion. Buddhism, on the other hand, believes in the ideal of the Parivrajka mendicant who seeks relief from suffering such as birth and disease, old age, and death. Thus, we see that the ideological backgrounds of these two religions were completely different. Because of this, translating the difficult technical terminology of Buddhism into Chinese was a great challenge. It was a difficult task to write Sanskrit and Pali names in hieroglyphic script of Chinese language by phonetic conversion. The conversion of names to alphabet-based script is not such a difficult task. Apart from the religious institutions of Luoyang and Chang'an working in the southern provinces of China, there was an acute shortage of people having knowledge of Sanskrit in China. Similarly, the Central Asian and Indian monks also did not know literary Chinese. During this period, various forms and ideological schools of Buddhism such as Hinayana and Mahayana arrived in China along with Buddhist monks from many countries. The translation of Buddhist terminology into Chinese during this period was ambiguous and dicey. Overall, the Chinese Buddhist translators were shooting arrows in the dark. In course of time, the concrete form of Chinese Buddhism developed. The Chinese script was divided into 3 categories: Northern, Southeastern and Southern. The variation in pronunciation was mainly expressed by the different forms of these script signs, although no change was made in the script. The Brahmi script is considered the mother of almost all modern written languages. These different scripts were developed in the 5th century. Today, the number of scripts derived from Brahmi is believed to be close to 40, including Tibetan, Singhala, Sharda, Nawari, Bengali, Oriya, Gujarati, Gurmukhi, Lahanda, Kannada, Telugu, Tamil, Malayalam, Burmese, Khmer, Lao, Thai and Devanagari. Apart from this, scripts like Japanese are also considered to be derived from the Indian script to some extent, based on the similarity found in the sequence of vowels. The earliest Brahmi script is found in the inscriptions of Emperor Ashoka, 270-232 B.C.A. The third ruler of the Mauryan dynasty. We find that in the history of translation of Buddhist scriptures into Chinese, the translators followed many translation rules and conventions. The translators used word symbols such as A, Yi, K, Ge, S, Fu, Mi Lo, Fu Sa, which are not often found in written Chinese. Words such as Maitreya and Bodhisattva were translated using sounds such as Mi Lo and Fu Sa. The Sanskrit word Sramana was translated by phonetic words like Shimen. In Chinese, the same word can be written in many different ways because the Chinese alphabet is quasi-phonetic. For example, Shana can mean good or benevolent or writing or mountain. The different meanings of Shana are clear from the way of speaking it. The difference in meaning due to pronunciation confused the translators of the time. Many times, Chinese translators could not understand the meaning of Sanskrit words properly and they used to translate those words by direct phonetic conversion. A similar mistake was made by Indian translators as well. For example, the Bhagavata was translated as Po. The Chinese word po was used in place of the Sanskrit syllables V, P, F, BH and VAT. In the initial period, there is no uniformity in the translation of special words and names among others. These words had to go through many phases of change. For example, the Buddha was known by both the names Fotu in Chinese, and many distortions appear in the Chinese address of the Buddha. Later, Fo was used to address the Buddha, which is probably a short form of Fotu. Sir Charles Eliot says that Fotu was formerly pronounced Wut-tha. From the ancient phonetic translation tradition till modern times, some special characters and traditional word signs have been used for transliteration. Transliteration is not a new invention and it has been used for the purpose of translation for a long time. During both the first and second glorious period of the Ha dynasty, China had deep political and trade ties with the West, and large numbers of people came and went from these countries. Transliteration of the names of these countries was required. Transliteration of 200 such geographical names is discussed during the Ha dynasty. Buddhist transliterators transcribed foreign sounds using improvised means available. An interesting system of transliteration of Indian words was prevalent in Buddhist literature. Indian words that had a clear meaning were directly carried over into Chinese, such as Thivakara for Divakara. Sometimes the names were translated into Chinese, depending on the meaning. For example, Tathagata was translated as Jiku Ang, rays of the sun. Similarly, the neighing of a horse is called Ma Ming, Ma horse, Ming sound. The blessings of the gods are called Tien Sho, Tien sky or deity, Wu Yu, Monlas, Julie, like one's ancestors coming into this world, are some more examples of this type of translation. This type of translation of Indian names reveals their real meaning. Amitabha was transliterated to Ami Tapio. It was also translated as Wu Liang Quang, incomparable light. There are many examples of this type of transliteration and translation in the Chinese, but it is difficult to say when and by whom they were translated. But there were many such words, which were not possible to transliterate or translate in this way, such as Nirvana and Samadhi. In the 34th chapter of the Japanese book Siddhakosha, written in CE 880, mentions that there are at least 49 such letters in the Sanskrit alphabet, which are very similar to their Chinese equivalent. A system called Fan Chie or Fan Yin was developed by Indian Buddhist monks, by which Pali and Sanskrit syllables were converted into Chinese. Fan Chie was a system of orthography in Chinese dictionaries that was greatly favored by King Kangxi, AD 1662-1723, of the Manchu dynasty. In this system, clauses of 2 letters were added and a new word was formed by combining the last letter of the first clause and the first letter of the second clause. For example, Fu Wan, to start late in the evening. Fan, to respect, to turn. Huan Chang and Yi Jing, the great and eminent scholars of Sanskrit, established some rules for the conversion of Sanskrit words related to Buddhism into Chinese. It is believed that due to his efforts, the Chinese adaptation of Sanskrit words could take a systematic form. Huan Chang considered transliteration of words related to Buddhism better than translation. In the early stages of Buddhist terms were translated on the basis of Taoist or Taoist terms. Taoism is a system of ethics that is sometimes considered philosophical, sometimes religious, sometimes it is also seen as a combination of the two. But it soon seemed that these translations did not reveal the underlying meaning of the original words. Seeing this, translators started transliterating the original words into Chinese. On this basis, words like pragya, permit and nirvana were written in Chinese language as Panjo, Palo Mitu, Ni Pan etc. At the end of the 4th century, the Chinese monk Tao En, himself a great bibliophile and compiler of religious texts, gave some practical suggestions to the translators associated with the Institute of Translation. As the head administrator of a team of transliterators, he had a deep understanding of the problems of transliteration. The problem before them was whether translation should be presented in a concise and refined form adapted to the needs of the people, or the translation should be kept close to the original text, due to which it was prone to repetition and complexity. The Tao En, in the preface of the Pragyaparamita Sutra, tells transliterators when they are allowed to depart from the text. In this sequence, he has mentioned those 3 points where the Sanskrit text should be expressed as it is. Huan Chang also established certain rules for translators. He was proficient in translation and used very precise Chinese words to translate Buddhist words. Due to the efforts of foreign missionaries and Chinese Buddhist monks, a large number of Buddhist sutras were translated into Chinese language. These sutras are considered to be the foundation of Buddhism. Thousands of new words were added to the Chinese language in the process. Enshi Kao of Parthia, Dharmarak from Tushara and Kumrajiva from Kutch were prominent among the foreign missionaries. It is also important to understand how much Buddhist terminology was known to the Chinese. Indian and Chinese Madhyamikas are full of technical terms related to religion. 2 indicators of the success of a Chinese translation of such technical terms were how close the translation was to the formal form of the original word and how well it was understood by the Chinese people. If these 2 conditions were met, the technical term was considered to have been translated correctly. Neo-Taoism had a strong influence on the Chinese literary environment in the 4th century. At the same time, the Pragya school of thought was increasing its influence among Buddhist thinkers. The philosophical background of both these streams was of the same type. According to Buddhist philosophy, the essence of all things is Sunya. Sunya is different from zero. Similarly, Neo-Taoism held that at the root of all matter is non-existence, Wu Wei. This statement is attributed to Liu Qin, AD 438 to 495. Among the hundreds of sutras translated into Chinese, Dharani has a large part. Looking at these sources, it seems that these are examples of transliteration more than translation. There does not appear to be any particular problem in the translation of Dharani. Neither deep knowledge of Sanskrit grammar nor of Sanskrit literature was necessary for this transliteration. For the transliteration of Dharani, only knowledge of the Indian script was necessary. Even before the spread of Buddhism, the Chinese society was familiar with Taoist magic sorcery. For this reason, Buddhist mantras attracted them a lot. The first Buddhist monk who reached Chang'an in CE 625 with thousands of Dharani and Sadhana mantras came from central India. These mantras were translated under the name of Tulo. Ni Chi Ching or Dhara Ni collection. Now these translations are available but the original mantras are not available. In the coming centuries, many seekers of the Tantra way reached China with a compilation of mantras. Of these, Shubhakar Singh, Vajrabodhi and Amogha Vajra are noteworthy. All of them were Indians. Shubhakar Singh translated the original text of Tantriyan, Mahavairochana. Throughout the long history of Buddhism in China, the work of translation has been carried on continuously by the selfless and painstaking efforts of monks and their disciples. The final edition of the Chinese Tripitaka, published in Japanese, discusses 85 books and 3053 mantras. There are very few examples of this type of accurate translation in human civilization on such a large scale. It cannot even be compared with modern times. India's philosophical thoughts and thinking, political and social system deeply influenced the Chinese public mind and culture. Even in the modern scientific age of Buddhism, it is wonderful that how this huge store of knowledge was translated into Chinese language only on the basis of human labor. Om Mani Padme Hum is the best known mantra of Buddhism. This mantra of 6 stanzas is a special mantra of Avalokiteshvar Bodhisattva, Chinese Guanyin. The Dalai Lama is considered an incarnation of Avalokiteshvar and that is why his followers give special importance to this mantra. Some European historians believe that the Mauryan ruler Ashoka dispatched the royal monk Masim Sthavira in 265 BCE to Nepal, China and Bhutan to propagate Buddhism. But it has not been confirmed from other sources whether the monk Sthavira really went to these countries to establish Buddhism. Some recent researches have shown that Buddhism was already established in China during the time of the first emperor of unified China, Qin Shi Huang, 259,210 BCE. Here it would be appropriate to discuss a little about this first ruler of Chinese history. It was during Shi Huang's reign that the translators of Buddhism faced a challenge for the first time. As the first emperor of China, Shi Huang exerted a profound influence on Chinese history and culture. The Great Wall of China and the terracotta warriors and horses associated with the name of this ruler still amaze people. Shi Huang was a ruthless and despotic ruler. It did not take him any time to kill or torture his opponents. It is believed that he burnt all the books composed before him. He also banned discussion or debate on history. Like other philosophical currents, he also tried to suppress Buddhism and its related places of worship. Researcher Ha Wei of Shanxi Provincial Archaeological Institute has confirmed this on the basis of records of the great historian and other historical, linguistic and archaeological evidence. This study reveals that Buddhism had already become popular in the interior of China before this process of suppression began in 213 BCE. Silk Route archaeologist Wang Tianjin also believes that Han's research is reliable. 5.4 Non-Chinese translators. In 148 CE, Monk and Shigao reached China. This is considered to be the beginning of translation of Buddhist texts into Chinese. Buddhism entered into China in 3rd century BCE during the rule of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. The first documentary evidence of translation by Buddhist monks dates back to the 2nd century. Perhaps the spread of the Kushan dynasty in the territory of China has been the reason for this. During the rule of the Kushans, trade with China from northwestern India and its surrounding areas was carried out both by road, via the Silk Road leading to China, and by sea. The etymology of the word Kushan is also believed to be from the Chinese word Guoshang, which is mentioned in historical documents. The rule of the 3rd Kushan Emperor Kanishka flourished from the end of the 1st century to the beginning or middle of the 2nd century. Kanishka's empire had 2 capitals, Purushpur, now called Peshawar, near the Khyber Pass, and Mathura in northern India. The reign of Kanishka was prosperous period of the Kushan dynasty. During his reign the Kushan Empire extended from the Gulf of Aral to modern-day Uzbekistan, Afghanistan and Pakistan. In North India, this empire was spread up to Banaras in the east and up to Sanchi in the south. It was a period of great prosperity. Trade and business were flourishing in urban life, Buddhist thought and the visual arts were at their height. Kanishka established a Buddhist temple in Loyang, the southern state of China. He also got Buddhist religious texts translated into Chinese. With this, the period of Central Asian religious conversion started, which continued for several centuries. And Shigao translated many texts related to the basic principles of Buddhism, meditation and perception. N. Shan, a commoner from Parthia who worked with N. Shigao, translated the early Buddhist Mahayana text on the path to the Bodhisattva into Chinese. Mahayana Buddhism was widely spread in China by the Kushan Buddhist monk Lokaksema, who was active between 164–186 CE. He came from the ancient Kushan kingdom of Gandhara. Lokaksema translated important early Mahayana sutras such as Ishtsahasrika Prajnaparamita Sutra, Samadhi and commentary on Buddha Akshobhya. These translations of Lokaksema provide a deep insight into Mahayana Buddhism. In the beginning, Buddhism had to face many difficulties in establishing a foothold in China. The concept of monasticism and the principle of abstaining from social affairs went against long-established beliefs and practices in Chinese society. During this period, great Indian Buddhist monks traveled to China to teach Buddhism through the Silk Road, and translation work was carried out mainly by foreign monks, not by Chinese. In the middle of the 2nd century, under the leadership of Kanishka, the Kushan Empire expanded to Central Asia. This empire was spread to Kashgar, Khotan and Yarkand in the Taram basin of modern Xinjiang. As a result, cultural exchange between the two countries increased considerably. Shortly thereafter, Buddhist missionaries from Central Asia became very active in the larger cities of China, Luoyang and occasionally Nanjing, where they earned a reputation for their translation work. He tried to promote both Hinena and Mahayana sects. Hinena is a Sanskrit and Pali language word, which literally means small vehicle. The word first appears during the 1st and 2nd centuries. Hinena is compared to Mahayana, which means the Great Way. There are a variety of concepts about what is the real meaning of Hinena. There is difference of opinion as to what it means, and to whom it refers. Those who worship the Bodhisattva, and recite the Mahayana sutras are called Mahayani. Those who do not do this are called Hineni. As mentioned earlier, Prince Enshikau of Parthia was the first to translate the texts of Hinena Buddhism into Chinese between 148–170 CE. The names of other notable people involved in the translation work are as follows. Lokashem Kushan, who first translated Mahayana texts into Chinese language between 167 to 186 CE. And Huan, merchant from Parthia, who became a monk in China in 181 CE. Ziyao, Kushan monk, translator of the 2nd generation after Lokashem, CE 185. Kang Menghiang, the first translator from Kangju to Chinese. Kangju is the name of an ancient civilization in Central Asia. It was a nomadic group of people whose tribal and ethnic origins are no longer known. CE 194,207. Ji Qian, Kushan monk, whose grandfather settled in China between 168,190. CE 220,252. Ji Yua, a Kushan monk working in Nanjing, CE 230. Kang Senhui, born in Chiaoqi, the southernmost region of the Chinese Empire, son of a Sogdian merchant, CE 247 to 280. Tanti, monk of Parthia, CE 254. Po Yen, prince of Kuchia, CE 259. Dharmaraksha, Kushan, whose family had lived in Dunhuang, Gansu province, China, for several generations, CE 265,313, and Fuchen, a monk of Parthian origin, CE 281 to 306, Mitra, a prince of Kuchia, CE 317,322, Teng, monk from Central Asia, who became an advisor in the Chinese court, 4th century CE, Bodhidharma, according to Yang Shanji, was a monk of Central Asian origin, whom he met in Luoyang province in southern China. Bodhidharma was the originator of Chan, Zen, school of Buddhism, CE 440,528. Around 485 CE, 5 monks from Gandhara came to Fusing, a village in ancient China. They propagated Buddhism there in the second year of damming of the Song dynasty through its religious books and pictures and inspired people to leave worldly bonds. Janana Gupta, CE 561 to 592, Buddhist monk. Translator of Gandhara Pradesh. Shikshananda, CE 652 to 710, Buddhist monk. Translator of Udyan, Gandhara. Pragya, CE 810, Buddhist monk and translator from Kabul, who taught Sanskrit to the Japanese Kukai. Sangapal, CE 250, was the eldest son of the Prime Minister of Soyana, Samarkand, the second largest city in Uzbekistan. The Sanghapalas settled in China during the rule of the Dongwu dynasty. The scriptures translated by him include Shatapamit Sangrah Sutra. This sutra means a collection of practices related to the 6 perfections. Its booklets were translated between CE 251 to 280. Dharmaraksha, CE 200 to 300, came to China from India. He was initiated at the age of 8. He was very talented in reading and writing. He knew 36 languages. He was known as the Tun Huang Bodhisattva during his travels with his 12 associate translators. He translated 175 scriptures in 354 booklets. Gautam Sanghadev, CE 300, belonged to Kabul. Between 383 to 398 CE, he translated 7 scriptures. Buddha Bhadra, CE 394,468, was invited by Guru Huiyen to live on Mount Lu from central India to translate the sutras. This mountain is near Zhujiang city in the south of Jiangxi province. He translated 125 booklets of 13 scriptures. Dharmanandi translated Madhyamagam as well as medium-length sutras into 69 books. Buddhayashas was born in Kashmir. He was a famous Indian Buddhist monk. He was the teacher and advisor of Kumrajiva regarding Buddhism. On reaching Chang'an, he was received by Emperor Yao Xing. In CE 408 he reached Chang'an. He translated the Dharma Guptak Vinay, or Vinay of the 4 classes, in 60 booklets between CE 410 to 412. In CE 412 he returned to Kashmir. It is said that from there he sent the material translated by him to China. Dharmashema, CE 385,433, reached China from central India during a period of internecine strife under the rule of the Liang dynasty. He was expert in debate. He translated 19 religious texts into 131 booklets. It also includes the Mahaparinirvana Sutra. He translated 40 booklets between 414 to 421. Gunabhadra, CE 394 to 468, was born in central India. He reached China from Ceylon. During the China conflict, he translated 52 scriptures into 134 booklets. Buddha Jiva, CE 423, specialized in translation of Vinay. He also translated the Mahishaska Vinay. Paramartha, CE 499 to 569, reached southern China from western India during the period of discord. He was considered a great translator of the category of Kumrajiva. But he did not get that much facilities for his work. He translated 50 scriptures into 120 booklets. Bodhiruchi, 5th century CE, came to China from North India. He was the president of the Translation Center there. 700 Buddhist monks translated 101 booklets of 30 scriptures there in 30 years. Pragyaruchi Brahma came to China from central India. He translated 18 scriptures into 92 booklets. 5.5 Kumrajiva, CE 344 to 413. Indian Buddhist monk and one of the world's greatest translators. Kumrajiva translated important Buddhist scriptures correctly into Chinese for the first time. Scriptures translated before him were very superficial and sometimes incomprehensible. A little discussion about the life of Kumrajiva would be relevant here. Kumrajiva was born in Kucha, a city in Central Asia. This place is located in the Akshu region of Xinjiang, China. His father was an Indian Brahmin, mother was a Kuching princess. His mother became a Buddhist nun when he was 7 years old. He spent the next several years traveling with his mother in Kucha, Kashmir and Kashgar, learning the tenets of Buddhism. He was initiated at the age of 20 in the royal palace of Kucha. He converted from Hinena to Mahayana in Kashgar. He became famous as a very talented Buddhist monk who had a deep knowledge of the different schools of Buddhism prevalent in North India at that time. In 379 CE, his fame as a great scholar of Buddhist texts spread to China and efforts were made to invite him to China. Fu Chen, the ruler of China, was so eager to have him at his court that according to some sources, he sent Lu Kuang, the general of his army, to conquer Kuch in 384 CE. Kumrajiva could reach Chogun only in the beginning of 402 CE. Kumrajiva started his work after a grand state reception by the emperor. He was given a state house to live in. He translated dozens of Buddhist religious texts and works into Chinese. Some of the most important Buddhist texts were also included in these. 5.5.1 Kumrajiva, translator and teacher. Kumrajiva collectively did the translation work. Sitting in front of hundreds of Buddhist monks, he led a team of Chinese experts. 800 Buddhist monks had gathered to help him in his work. During the translation of these texts, Kumrajiva was also answering the questions being raised about them. Perhaps unwittingly, many of his answers were also included in the Chinese translation. There are many types of shortcomings in this translation, but overall Kumrajiva and his colleagues prepared a reliable translation of difficult religious compositions. The important fact is that there are every kind of variation we can imagine between the original language and the translated language. One of the reasons for this success was probably Kumrajiva's liberal vision. His philosophical thought included the entire Mahayana school. The Sanskrit meaning of Mahayana is the greater vehicle. The Mahayana school of Buddhism and Theravada, doctrine of the ancestors, are the two main branches of the Buddhist faith. The religious source of Theravada Buddhism is the Tripali Dharma Shastra Tripitaka. It is believed that the oldest form of Buddha's teachings is still preserved in Tripitaka. For centuries, Theravada has been the dominant religion of the Southeast Asia, Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos and Sri Lanka. Mahayana originated in India and spread to China, Korea, Japan, Tibet, Central Asia, Vietnam and Taiwan. Followers of Mahayana traditionally believe that the fully developed form of the teachings of Mahatma Buddha appears in this school. They consider the Hinena to be an inferior instrument and believe that the full form of the Buddha's teachings would have been reflected in it. Kumrajiva did not want to present any opinion by distorting it for his selfishness. His own works are rare. The most important work from the point of view of understanding his thoughts is his commentary on Vimalakirtinirdesha Sutra. His letters written after 405 CE to Hui Yuan are also very interesting. Emperor Yao Xing forced Kumrajiva to break his vow of celibacy and live in a harem of 10 female dancers because he did not want such a talented person to have no children. For his stay, luxurious arrangements were made outside the Buddhist monastery. Kumrajiva seemed to have pained to transgress the principles of Buddhism, and instructed his listeners to follow his good teachings and leave the diversion. He was one of the 4 great Buddhist monks of Central Asia, who went to China, and worked on the translation of Chinese Buddhist texts. He joined the monastic tradition. At the age of 7, he had received erudition in both Sarvastivadin and Mahayana studies. Before starting the work of translation, Kumrajiva got the opportunity to acquire proficiency in Chinese language. Due to his expertise in both Indian Buddhist philosophy and Chinese language, his translations are still accepted as standard. For example, his translation of the Kamla Sutra. His translations also helped clear up misconceptions about Buddhist doctrines such as the doctrine of sunyata. He is believed to have done more than 100 translations. Of these, only 24 can be reliably considered to be his. But they contain the most important books of Chinese Buddhism. Kumrajiva's writing translation work had an epoch-making impact on the Buddhist thought philosophy of China. This involved not only making previously unavailable texts available by him, but also included the arrangement of various sutras and philosophical concepts of Buddhist philosophy. He, along with his disciples, laid the foundation of the Chinese branch of Madhyamika, which became known as Sanlun or Trisiddhantavada. He gained the status of the greatest teacher to come from the western region and was highly respected among Chinese Buddhist thinkers. Many young and old Buddhist Chinese people came to him and benefited from his teachings and translation work. Important Buddhist texts translated by Kumrajiva are Hirak Sutra, Abhitabha Sutra, Kamla Sutra, Vimalakirtinirdesh Sutra, Mula Madhyamika Karika, Ishtsahasrika Prajnapamita, Mahaprajnapamita Updesha, which is said to have been written by Nagarjuna. His style of translation was distinctive, in which a smooth flow was visible. He gave more importance to clarifying the meaning, not literal translation. For this reason, translations of the fundamental texts of the Mahayana sect have been more prevalent and popular. Kumrajiva had 4 disciples, Dao Sheng, Sheng Chao, Dao Rong, and Sheng Rui. Kumrajiva was highly respected. Emperor Yao Sang arranged large buildings for him and his associates to help with the translation of the sutras. Sometimes the emperor himself was involved in the translation work. Before his death, Kumrajiva declared that if his translation was really in accordance with the principles of Buddhism, then his tongue would not burn after his death. After his cremation, it is believed that his tongue remained intact. Between 401 to 413 CE, Kumrajiva translated 74 scriptures in 384 booklets. Some of the major ones are as follows. Satyasiddhi Shastra, that is, the scripture of the perfection of truth. 20 booklets related to this were written between 402 to 412 CE. Ishtsahasrika Prajnapamita Sutra, that is, discretionary formula. Its 10 books were completed in 408 CE. Vajrachedika Prajnapamita Sutra means Diamond Sutra. A booklet was completed in 402 to 412 CE. Sadharm Pundrika Sutra means Kamla Sutra. It has 8 booklets. Sankshipt Sukhvativyu, i.e., Amitabh Sutra. One of its books was completed in 402 CE. Madhyamika Shastra means intermediate commentary. Its 4 booklets were completed in 409 CE. Shatika Shastra, that is, commentary on 100 mantras. Its 2 booklets were completed in 409 CE. Dwadashmukh Shastra, that is, commentary on the 12 gates. One of its books was completed in 409. Sarvastivadin Vinay, that is, Vinay-oriented commentary of 10 categories. Its 61 books were completed between 404-409 CE. 5.6 Chinese translators. Qi Qian came to China from Kushan around 200 CE during the rule of the Wang Wu dynasty. He translated 88 scriptures of the Hinayana and Mahayana sects. Famous Chinese Buddhist monk Xuanzang, CE 600 to 664, came to India. He recorded various incidents of suppression of Buddhists by Shashanka, the Gauda king, king of Northwest Bengal. He scripted Mahayana Buddhism prevalent in different parts of Bangladesh. He went back to China with 657 Sanskrit texts. After going there, he established a huge translation center in Chang'an. It brought together students and colleagues from various countries in East Asia. It is said that more than 600 translators worked under his supervision. It is believed that he translated 1330 booklets related to scriptures into Chinese. Before him, Kumrajiva used to work with a team of 400 translators. Xuanzang's birth is believed to be around 600 CE. He took initiation at the age of 20. Like other Chinese pilgrims, Xuanzang also made the arduous journey to India with the aim of visiting Indian Buddhist pilgrimage sites. He was dissatisfied with the Chinese translation of Indian Buddhist scriptures available at that time. That's why they wanted to come to India and get the original texts and wanted to take the teachings of Buddhism directly from the Indian gurus. Expressing his dissatisfaction with the translations of Buddhist scriptures available in China at that time, he says, Buddha was born in the West, but his religion has spread to the East. During the translation, there may have been errors in the text, wrong use of the phrases used. Wrong words make the right meaning disappear. The use of wrong phrase distorts the basic principle itself. The success of Xuanzang's mission can be judged not only by the 657 Buddhist scriptures that he brought from India to China, but also by the high standard of his translation. He is counted among the 3 greatest Chinese translators of ancient times. According to Chinese sources, Zhu Jijing was the first person to be initiated into Samanyasa. He went to Central Asia in 260 CE in search of Buddhism. From the 4th century onwards, Chinese Buddhist monks started coming to India directly in search of Buddhism. F.A. Jian's pilgrimage to India, CE 395 to 414, is considered the first important journey. He reached India through the Silk Road. After staying here for 16 years, he went back to China by sea route. Even before Xuanzang's visit to India in 627 CE, the institutions related to Buddhist monasteries and the principles of Buddhism had taken deep roots in China. By this time, almost all the early scriptures had been translated into Chinese. Buddha's teachings were translated into Chinese within the framework of the then Taoist and Confucian principles. A large number of commentaries related to these were being written at the local level. F.A. Jian traveled to India between 395-414 CA. He has discussed the kingdom of Champa situated on the southern bank of the Ganges. Here, he found that Mahayana Buddhism was still alive among the people. After his return, he translated about 40 booklets of the text of the Mahaparinirvana Sutra and 6 booklets related to Vinay. He was considered the first important Chinese pilgrim. He wrote a book titled Documents of Buddhist Kingdoms, record of travels to 30 countries like India, Sri Lanka etc. He completed the translation of 6 volumes of Mahaparinirvana Sutra and 40 volumes of Mahasanghika Vinay with Buddha Bhadra between 416 to 418 CE. Compared to F.A. Jian and Xuanzang, the works of Yijing have received less attention from students and scholars of Asian and world history. Yijing started his journey to India in 671 CE and returned to China in 695 CE. Before returning to China, he completed 2 very important texts from the Arivijay Empire located in modern Indonesia and sent them to China. He sent to China records of the practical form of Buddhism in India from the South Sea and the memoirs of prominent sannyasins who traveled to India and its neighboring regions in search of the rules of the Dharma during the Great Tang dynasty. In the first of these texts, there is a detailed discussion of the principles of Buddhism and the rules and regulations of the monasteries in India. In the second book, the biographies of 56 Chinese Buddhist monks who came to India from China in the 7th century have been written in detail. Yi Jing's memoirs describe the terrible dangers he faced on his journey to India. It states that despite these dangers, a large number of Buddhist monks kept coming to India from China in the 7th century. Some of these people reached India by land through Central Asia and Tibet. Like Yi Jing, some other people also reached India by sea route through the ports of Southeast Asia. Some of these people went back to China and some settled in India. Some people died in India itself. An important name among these travelers is Shan Chao. Yi Jing wrote his biography in the first booklet. They give Shan Chao's genealogy and discuss his experiences learning the doctrines of Buddhism. It includes the story of his long journey to India via Tibet, his education in Indian monasteries, and his return to China via Nepal and Tibet. As soon as he reached China, Emperor Gaozong of the Tang dynasty sent him back to India to bring doctors and age-enhancing medicines. Yi Jing wrote that Shan Chao was successful in obtaining what the emperor asked for, but died before he could return to China. The other 55 biographies also show how strong was the desire of the Chinese priestly class to travel and study at Buddhist pilgrimage sites in India. Xu Yin Ye was an assistant in the translation work of Buddhayashas. He translated 74 booklets of 12 religious texts, including the Dirgha Agam. Dirgha Agam means long sermon. It has 22 books and was translated in the year 412. 413 CE. 5.7 Problems of translation of Buddhist texts. Buddhist conversion started during the reign of Emperor Ashoka, CE 260 to 218. It is mentioned in the Buddhist tradition that in 2nd century BCE, the Indo-Greek emperor Menander converted to Buddhism and became an Arhat. Arhat means perfect, who has conquered the three poisons of desire, hatred and ignorance. After this he becomes free from the bondage of birth and death. In other sense he attains nirvana by being free from the cycle of birth and death. The spread of Buddhism was very slow in India before Emperor Ashoka. With the support of Ashoka and other emperors of his dynasty, there was a spurt in the construction of Buddhist stupas. His efforts resulted in the spread of Buddhism beyond the extended boundaries of the Maurya Empire and to neighboring nations, especially the Iranian-speaking regions of Afghanistan, Central Asia, beyond the Mauryan empires, northwestern frontier, and towards South India and Sri Lanka. This two-pronged movement led to the introduction of Buddhism into China and the rise of Theravada Buddhism, which spread from Sri Lanka to the coastal regions of Southeast Asia. The Theravada school spread from India in the 3rd century BCE and later reached Indonesia via Sri Lanka, Thailand and Burma. According to the philosophy of this school, there are three fundamental characteristics of this world. It is mortal and transitory, meaningless and also temporary. In the 3rd century BCE, the Dharmagupta school spread to Kashmir, Gandhara and Bactria, Afghanistan, in the north. In the 2nd century, the Mahayana Sutras reached Korea and Japan via China and were translated into Chinese. During the Indian period, the esoteric Buddhism spread outside India to Tibet and Mongolia after the 8th century. There are many types of texts and compositions related to Buddhism. Different schools of Buddhism give different importance to the learning of different texts. Buddhist scriptures are written in Pali, Tibetan, Mongolian, Chinese. Some texts have also been written in Sanskrit and Buddhist mixed Sanskrit by the scholars of these countries. Due to being written in different languages, there is no equivalence or similarity between the expressions used in these texts and the meaning. The originality appears distorted in a way in these texts and their meaning becomes different in different countries. Unlike many other religions, no single text is considered to be the basis by the various schools of Buddhism. Resultantly, many types of misconceptions arise. The agamas are considered only preliminary sutras in the Mahayana school and in Tibetan Buddhism. Most of the agamas are not even translated. According to Buddhism, agamas mean compilation of various teachings in one place, which are called sutras in Sanskrit and suttas in Pali. They have been used in the early philosophy of Buddhism and have been preserved in the Chinese tradition. Other scholars maintain that there is no universally accepted central book or text in Buddhism. The vastness and complexity of Buddhist aphorisms has been seen by Buddhist social reformer Dr. Bhim Rao Ambedkar and some other thinkers as an obstacle to understanding the underlying philosophy of Buddhism. The followers of Theravada Buddhism consider the Pali teachings to be fundamental and authentic. Mahayana Buddhists consider the Mahayana Sutras and their Vinaya to be the core of their faith and philosophy. In Buddhist scriptures, Vinaya means a set of limits prescribed by Dharma. The Pali Sutras and other religious texts associated with them are accepted as agamas in other Buddhist schools. For a long time, people have tried to organize a single Buddhist scripture by gathering the basic tenets of Buddhism in one place. Within the Theravada school, certain sutras were selectively collected for study. Popular and important scriptures were collected in a volume which was studied by Buddhist monks in the initial period. Later in Sri Lanka, an attempt was made to present the Dhammapada as a similar unifying scripture. Recently, Dr. Bhim Rao Ambedkar wrote a book named The Buddha and His Dhamma with a view to collect the principles of Buddhism at one place. Even today, many such efforts are being made, but not a single book has been accepted as the representative scripture of Buddhism. 5.8 Summary. Today it is astonishing to see the painstaking effort by scholars from India, other parts of Asia and China to translate Buddhist scriptures into Chinese. Many scholars from India made arduous journeys to China and stayed there for many years to accomplish this difficult task. They started the translation work by learning Chinese language. The most notable name among non-Chinese scholars is that of Kumrajiva. Similarly, many Chinese scholars and travelers made difficult journeys by land and sea and reached India. Staying here for many years, they acquired knowledge of Sanskrit and Pali language and after that they translated Buddhist scriptures into Chinese language. Shan Zhang and F.A. Jian are the best examples of this. The principles of translation adopted by the Buddhist monks after the year 200 CE were at first preserved orally, later they were written directly from Sanskrit into ancient Chinese script. Since paper had not been invented in those days, they were written on bamboo sticks. Many times, they were not even visible at first sight. Sometimes it was very difficult to understand them. The biggest problem for the early Buddhist translators was to express the new events in their own language. For this, new words and new Chinese signs were created. This used to increase the beauty of Chinese language even more. The second problem was the knowledge of at least two languages, Sanskrit or Pali, and Chinese. Buddhist monks and Chinese monks coming from India and Central Asia used to do translation work together. The Buddhist monks coming from the Western region had a very limited knowledge of Chinese language. They could barely speak a few sentences. The Chinese also had little knowledge of Buddhism and could not speak any foreign language. The most difficult part was to translate proper nouns from Sanskrit to Chinese. There was a lot of debate on whether that proper noun should be translated on the basis of its meaning or should be transliterated on the basis of its pronunciation. The second problem was understanding the true meaning of Buddhist texts and expressing them in Chinese. Naturally, everyone understands meaning differently, and the same applies to translation. But later, Buddhist texts started being translated more accurately. The quality of translation improved significantly after the 16th century, when scholars began to apply more scientific methods to the language of the translated text and the use of meaningful Chinese words. In this direction, Japanese and Tibetan scholars and monks also contributed a lot. Their understanding of Buddhist scriptures and their translation into Japanese also helped improve the translation process. Later, in the nearly 900-year history of Chinese translation, the level of translation was raised and efforts were made to make the translated text appear with the naturalness of the Chinese language. There were no equivalent words in Chinese for many of the Buddhist ideas. So many translators began to express these concepts and Buddhist beliefs in a form of local Taoist thought that was easier for everyone to understand. The root of the difference between Chinese Buddhism and Indian Buddhism can be found in the early translations. The creation of new posts sometimes had wonderful results. For example, Parthamasaris of Persia is counted among the earliest translators of Buddhism. He tried to express the sound and meaning of the concept anapana related to pranayam in Chinese language. In the beginning they simply transliterated the word. But that was not enough, as the word had no meaning in Chinese. But in Buddhist culture, anapana means closing the door of the mind to all kinds of thoughts, means to make the mind thoughtless. Thus, these two fundamental ideas are completely different from each other. The entry of Buddhist scriptures into China and their translation into Chinese continued for more than 1,200 years. The work of translation began in the late Han Dynasty, 2nd century CE. More or less this work continued until the end of the Song Dynasty and the beginning of the Yuan Dynasty, 13th century CE. When this work of translation started in China, the Chinese were not aware that Buddhism in India has been divided into different sects and schools which stand in opposition to each other. His teachings and preaching were also sometimes contrary to each other. In the initial phase of the translation work, all those books and lessons which appeared to be important were translated. Many books and texts were translated over and over again over the centuries. In this sequence, that phrase and its understanding kept getting better. Printing techniques were used as early as the 7th century to protect official copies of scriptures and prevent them from being distorted. It was started by a Buddhist monk living in a small monastery in northern China, who began to inscribe the most important scriptures on the rocks. This process continued for centuries and today 14,000 such rocks are available, on which hundreds of lessons related to the basic principle of Chinese Buddhism are inscribed. Some important efforts have been made by a group in the direction of collecting the complete text of the entire Buddhist Tripitaka and making it available to the people in Chinese language. In January 1998, the said group of a Japanese university entered into an agreement with the Daijo Shupansha, by which it was given the right to create an electronic database of the Tesho Tripitaka and make it available on the internet. The scheduled completion date of the program was 2006. Quite apart from this, in the beginning of 1999, it came to know that a Buddhist group in Hong Kong had made a compact disc, CD, of the entire Chinese Buddhist Tripitaka. From this it can be concluded that the 85 volumes of Tesho Tripitaka were released on CD. Unfortunately, it can only be read by software that was prepared by the people who created that CDs. It required the traditional Chinese version of Microsoft Windows. Like the Korean Tripitaka, this software is also an attempt to read it like a book on the computer screen. But this is a failed attempt from the point of view of using new possibilities of electronic medium. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next video with the next chapter.